Hey students, what's up? Jessica Bowman here. Thank you so much for gathering with us this way online. Hey, great news is I have an invitation just for you. An invitation to come here at the building in our garage on Sundays at 9 a.m. So consider gathering with us. I hope you take us up on this invitation and come here this summer and gather with us here in the garage. Hope to see you soon. Enjoy today's teaching.
Who is Jesus? We are in part 4 of this series where we've been wrestling with that question. As we've been exploring the Gospel of Matthew, Matthew was one of Jesus' disciples, one of his followers, who after the death of Jesus, after the crucifixion of Jesus, after the resurrection of Jesus, Matthew felt compelled to write down the stories of his time with Jesus, to share about this man with others. And as we've been walking through this journey together, we've started by exploring the idea that in part 1, Jesus is Emmanuel, which means God with us. In part 2 of our series, we looked at Jesus being the Son of Man, which has this beautiful dual meaning of him being fully human, so he can relate to us, but also fully God, so he is capable of doing and getting us to the places we can't on our own. And then in part 3, we talked about Jesus being the Messiah, the anointed one, the chosen one of God, who God sent into the world to undo the damage of sin and evil. But in this part 4 of our series, we're looking at Jesus as King. Who is Jesus? I would say that Jesus is King. Now, what's interesting about the idea of kingship in the Bible is that the nation of Israel, this is where God's chosen people, who God had set apart to be his representatives to all the world, had a very specific process that anybody who was going to be king would go through. It was a 3-step process. It started with designation, moved to demonstration, and then was completed with coronation. Designation, demonstration, coronation. The 3-step process for someone to become king of the nation of Israel. And what's so beautiful about Matthew's gospel is that he sort of structures the entire book around that 3-step process to help us understand that Jesus is the rightful king of Israel. But even more than that, that Jesus is the rightful king of all creation. And when we look at the Gospel of Matthew, we are taken on this journey through Jesus' designation, his demonstration, and his coronation. So, designation. This is the moment when a future king would be chosen by God to become king. In the Old Testament, David, who was the greatest king Israel had ever known, was designated by the prophet Samuel. He was the youngest of all of his brothers. And one day Samuel shows up to his home and pours oil on his head. That oil was symbolizing the Spirit of God descending upon him, designating him as the rightful king of Israel. Jesus' designation took place at his baptism. But what's so interesting about this is it wasn't a prophet pouring oil on his head. It was actually the heavens opening up and the Spirit of God descending upon Jesus. And you could hear the voice of God declaring that this is my son with whom I am well pleased. Jesus' designation kind of made David's look a little bit, small, weak sauce, which is crazy because like I said, David was the greatest king Israel had ever known. And then Jesus shows up and his designation puts David's to shame. Then there's the demonstration, right? After the king is chosen, after he's designated to be the future king of Israel, he has to demonstrate his worthiness to be king. Because to be king of Israel is a big deal. They are responsible for leading the people of God, representing God to the people, and leading that nation of people to represent God to the rest of the world. For Jesus, right after his baptism, he also went on a journey that included 40 days. But this time it was him going into the wilderness for 40 days to be tempted by another giant. But this one wasn't just a man who happened to be really big. This one was the giant that comes after all of us, the enemy, the devil. Jesus went toe to toe with him in the desert, was tested 3 different times. And every test that Jesus went through was meant to be a callback to the test that the people of Israel had gone through so many years ago when they were wandering the wilderness between Egypt and the promised land. And every time the people of Israel were tested, then they failed. But when Jesus is face to face with this giant, when he is being tempted in the wilderness, every time he's tempted, he overcomes the temptation and he proves that he can do what nobody else can. He demonstrates his worthiness to be king. There's a designation, there's a demonstration, and then there's a coronation. The coronation is the moment where this king has a crown placed on their head, where they're seated on the throne, and all the people acknowledge this is the real king. This is the true king. And what's so beautiful about Jesus' coronation, and what's so confusing about Jesus' coronation, is that it really caused people to question, how does any of this make sense? His designation was incredible. His demonstration was unheard of, but his coronation, I can't even wrap my mind around it. And that's why the Apostle Paul, writing a letter to one of the early Christian communities, described the coronation of Jesus as a stumbling block to Jews and foolishness to Gentiles. It's a stumbling block for the Jewish people because they cannot wrap their mind around the idea that the king of creation, the king of Israel, would be coronated in this way. And it's foolishness to Gentiles because there is no way I would ever follow a king who is coronated like that, because everything about Jesus' coronation defied everyone's expectations to the point where they didn't know what to do with it. So why is it that Jesus' coronation was a stumbling block to Jews and foolishness to Gentiles? Because Jesus' coronation was actually his crucifixion. Jesus' crowning moment was the moment when he was hanging on a cross. He chose to be killed on a cross to show the kind of king that he is. What we read in verse 35 is that they had crucified him. And when they did, they divided up his clothes by casting lots. And now sitting down, these soldiers keep watch over him. Above his head, they place the written charge against him. This is his crime. It says, "This is Jesus, the King of the Jews." This is Jesus, the Son of God and the King of the Jews? Who is this Jesus? And why in the world would this be his coronation as king? It's interesting because when we continue on, in verse 42, there are people mocking him. They say, he saved others, but he can't save himself. Right? He's the King of Israel, so let him come down now from the cross, and if he does, we'll believe in him. He trusts in God, so let God rescue him now if he wants him. Because, guys, he said he's the Son of God. And if that's true, then God should want to rescue him. If he's really the Son of God, then why would he be hanging on a cross like that? This is what makes Christianity so beautiful. Because we serve a God who didn't just sit up in heaven and watch us in our pain, but he hung on a cross and he became suffering for us. He chose to suffer with us. He allowed himself to die in our place. Jesus is the God revealed through suffering. And yet Jesus' crowning moment was his crucifixion. As we continue reading in the story, picking up in verse 50, Jesus cries out again in a loud voice, and he gives up his spirit. And it's at that moment that the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. The earth shook, the rocks split, and the tombs broke open. And then continuing on, the centurion who was leading those Roman soldiers who had been the people to carry out the execution of Jesus, that centurion and those with him who were guarding Jesus saw the earthquake. They see all that had happened. They're terrified and they exclaim, "Surely he was the Son of God." The same man who mockingly called him king just hours ago now declares in front of everyone that something about this Jesus is special. Not only is he King of the Jews, but he is surely the Son of God. You see, the beautiful thing about Jesus is that his entire life, he was preparing for that moment on the cross. He was designated at his baptism. He demonstrated his worthiness in the wilderness by overcoming the temptations of the devil. And he was coronated by being murdered in the most humiliating and shameful way possible. And the beautiful thing about Jesus is that death could not hold him. Sin could not stop him. So what does that mean for us? For those of us who are Christians, followers of Jesus, reconciling and wrestling with this idea that the King of creation died on a cross. How do we do anything with that? The beauty of the gospel is that it is so much bigger than anybody could ever imagine. You see, the gospel, it's the good news announcement that through the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, that our God has once again become king. That his kingdom is coming on earth as it is in heaven. And everybody everywhere has been invited to be a part of his kingdom. If you are a follower of Jesus, you have a job to do, to spread the rule and reign of your King Jesus to every corner of creation. What does that look like? It looks like being willing to live a cross-shaped life in our self-centered culture. It looks like a call to beautiful resistance when people are attacking you and persecuting you and insulting you. It means you responding with love and prayer in the same way that your King Jesus responded so long ago. The gospel, it's really good news. It's the news that the real ruler of everything, the real King of creation, is the God who became man, who was willing to suffer and die in the most humiliating and shameful way possible, who did not stay dead, and who has invited all of us, no matter what we've done or where we've been, to be a part of his new family, his kingdom of transformed, forgiven, redeemed people. And that's really good news.